Okay, Exequiel.
Okay.
As you know, you've got 15 minutes to present.
Mm-hmm.
After your presentation, you'll have a seat and we'll ask you some questions about your presentation.
Perfect.
You can start now.
Okay. Good morning, professors. Today I'm going to present my research study, which has to do with the use of chunks of language and its influence on student self-efficacy in dialogue writing activities in an TEFL adult context. So, to begin with, the global context of this study relates to the constant English learning process in the classroom. UNESCO in 2003 states that English opens doors to new cultures, new customs, new people, and communication with others. Mineduc in 2016 states that specifically writing can be useful to achieve goals inside the classroom by means of communication. So the specific context of this study relates to a group of 25 students from different careers that attended English Basic 1 here at the university. They were constantly exposed to explicit learning and phrases of common use in English, such as how are you, hello, where are, etc. Regarding the empirical background, Richards and Rogers state that these chunks of language, that set of phrases, can be useful for communication. And Lee in 2015 states that chunks of language can be memorized and then produced given a certain context. The theoretical background relies on Brown 2007, who states that there's a vast amount of personality factors that may affect students' competence, students' performance inside the classroom. And he explains the concept of self-efficacy, which basically means the students' capacity to realize how capable they are to perform certain tasks. Also, Brown makes a differentiation between explicit learning and implicit learning by stating that there has to be a balance between both ways of teaching. However, there are some deficiencies in knowledge. For example, Williams in 2005 states that this differentiation relies more on implicit learning being the most useful strategy to teach English rather than explicit learning. Also, Prashenas Karchela back in the 70s stated that chunks of language, that is to say these set of phrases, are only an outperformance strategy. So there is no intention of students and the teacher to make and to internalize the contents, but only memorizing set of phrases and then producing them. Therefore, the purpose of this study relies on understanding how these chunks of language may be useful to make the students improve their writing skills during the class, and to see if these chunks of language can be realized by students so they can see if they find themselves capable of performing certain tasks. So the research question is stated as follows. What is the possible influence of the application of a set of chunks of language on students' self-efficacy in dialogue writing activities in an TEFL adult context? The general objective to understand the possible influence of the use of a specific set of chunks of language on students' self-efficacy when dialogue writing activities are carried out in the same context. And two specific objectives, being the first one to examine the students' self-efficacy in dialogue writing activities, and the second one to assess the impact of the application of a specific set of chunks of language in dialogue activities regarding students' perceptions of self-efficacy. So at the beginning of the process, it was assumed that there was an influence of chunks of language on students' writing skills. And also it was assumed that the students were going to be able to realize how capable they are to perform these tasks. So, regarding the theoretical framework, here I present you the concept map in which you can see the main variables of my study being chunks of language, self-efficacy, and dialogue activities, and sources they stem from. For example, self-efficacy stems from the vast amount of personality factors that are present in a classroom. And here I have a quote from Duoviciene and Gulbinskiene. It says, all adults come to courses with a variety of experiences, both in terms of their working life and educational backgrounds. What do they mean by this? At this stage in the learning process, unlike in secondary or primary education, for example, students come with different educational backgrounds, and also they have different working experiences. So they can relate those experiences to their own English learning. So, what are chunks of language? There is a differentiation between the concept between the 20th century and the 21st century. Authors from the 20th century state that chunks of language are only set of phrases and only prefabricated patterns, but anything else. However, 21st century authors state that these chunks of language may provide a context for students, and they are also useful for communication. So, in general terms, they have lexical functions as well. Self-efficacy. Bandura states that self-efficacy is a student's capacity to realize how able they are to perform certain tasks. And there are some sources from which students can relate this self-efficacy. For example, past experiences, others' capacities, trust in others' capacities, etc. Dialogue activities, which are basically conversational situations that arise from a specific context inside the classroom. English as a foreign language, as it is widely known, it is English that is spoken only inside the classroom but not outside, unlike ESL, for example. And adult education basically relies on students who have graduated from school and they go to the university, or they attend an educational institution after being graduated. And they also range from 18 to 24 years old. So it's kind of similar to the context in which this study was carried out. So the methodology. This study follows the lines of the qualitative approach, which basically means that certain phenomenon is addressed by observing and describing it. Okay? And it also follows the interpretive paradigm that, unlike critical studies, for example, interpretive studies only observe a phenomenon from the outside, but the researcher is not involved in the context. So in critical studies, for example, there is a need to change some reality in the context, but not in this case. And this study was designed as a phenomenological one. Why? Because the main attempt of phenomenology is to address the participants' experiences and try to build meaning collectively. So it is a matter of addressing this phenomenon by observing, describing, and then relating all the participants' perceptions to come up with that general meaning. Also, there are two types of phenomenological studies. The first one is the empirical one. The empirical phenomenology mainly focuses on raw data that is taken from the context and the researcher draws some inferences on those observations. However, this study was designed as hermeneutic. Why? Because the hermeneutic phenomenology takes into account the participants' perceptions, and alongside the researchers' inferences, meaning is built collectively. So the participants for this study were 8 people, eight of my students. most of them from the psychology program. They were chosen randomly. I asked them that I wanted to carry out a study, and I needed people for this, and some hands raised up. And the scenario, well, we together chose that a scenario in which they felt comfortable enough and under no pressure. So the scenario decided to carry out the instrumentation was the university yard. So the procedure focuses on two steps: the instrumentation and the data analysis techniques. Two instruments were chosen, being the first one field notes, which defined by Van Manen are only raw data, empirical information taken from a certain context. And a focus group. A focus group is a type of conversation in which the participants' perceptions are taken into account and meaning is built collectively. And two data analysis techniques, being the first one, coding matrices, in which all this corpus or information that is taken from the field notes and from the focus group, they are assigned a category and, well, in both matrices. So two matrices are created. And then a triangulation process in which these two matrices overlap, so links can be found. However, for qualitative studies, there are 4 criteria that are used to address trustworthiness. The first one is credibility, which has to do with the confidence in the truth of the findings, in words of Lincoln and Buber. How this criterion can be addressed? Basically by a triangulation process in which all the information is not biased by the researcher, given that the information taken from the field notes and the participants' perceptions are linked, so they are similar. Second one, dependability, which has to do with the consistency of findings over time. So in order to address dependability, it is necessary to draw thick descriptions of the procedure and the phenomenon itself. The third one, confirmability, in words of Santo, 2004, it has to do with the data not being biased by the researcher. And how this information is not biased? Basically because field notes are raw data, observations, pure observations, and the focus group was audio recorded and the participants' perceptions were transcribed. So the information is not biased by the researcher. And last one, transferability, which has to do with transferring this phenomenon to another context in which the results can be similar. In order to address this criterion, it is necessary to, as well as in dependability and credibility, to provide thick descriptions of both procedure and the phenomenon itself. So, this is the presentation of data. Here I have the first matrix of field notes, in which this information, which is corpus, was assigned a code and an emerging category based on the main variables of my step. The second matrix, the procedure to create this matrix was kind of similar to the previous one, in which the information taken from the focus group, you can see question 1, question 2, etc. That's also corpus, is assigned a code and an emergent category based on what the students stated. And the last one is the triangulation matrix, in which a code is given encompassing information from the field notes and from the focus group, and a new category arose, which is in more general terms providing the findings of my study. So the data analysis, here's a representation of what I stated before. Matrix 1 came up with categories that were related to the main variables of my study, that is to say, chunks of language, self-efficacy, etc. And matrix 2, regarding what the students, the participants, stated regarding the variables. So there were some categories here in matrix 2 that were related to chunks of language by means of contextualization, communication, and their actual use inside the classroom. So what was observed and what was elicited from the participants was triangulated here, and new categories arose. So the findings. Regarding what I mentioned before, this 21st century conceptualizations of chunks of language, it was found that the students' perceptions regarding the use of common expressions in the classroom was similar to what the literature suggests. And it could be concluded that the students tend to relate their self-efficacy levels to what others know. For example, I have a classmate that is more competent than I am. So if I have questions or doubts, I can ask him and he will provide me with information. So I can develop my own learning process by trusting other people. That's also related with the literature suggests on self-efficacy. However, there were some limitations for this study. Fernandez and Baptista in 2014 state that the most appropriate amount of people considered for a focus group ranges between 12 and 20. However, I only got to interview 8 people. Not only because they were not willing to participate, but they were not able. There was no availability from them. Therefore, there are some considerations for further research, basically based on longer observation. We all know that we are given only about 3 months to observe, describe, and come up with all the findings. So it may be advisable that this phenomenon is addressed in a longer period of time. And also to elicit a vaster amount of perceptions from more participants because of what the literature suggests, and to see if these chunks of language can actually influence writing competence, and also to see if students can realize about that and reflect upon it. Okay, my metacognitive analysis, I wanted to represent it in a table. Regarding the teachers and researchers' role, I have some strengths here. For example, I have got to develop my own teaching style. I feel more secure now in the classroom rather than I was on primary levels or secondary levels, where I was kind of afraid of my students because of I don't know, my own personality factors that also affect. I got to build rapport with my students. I became their friend, with some of them of course, and I tried to create a positive atmosphere always. And also responsibility in both, being a teacher and being a researcher. I always try to comply with all the requirements on due time. So I've always considered myself responsible. However, there are some weaknesses. For example, I still struggle with the variety of strategies that I need to use in the classroom. I always stick to the classics, to the old trustful, but there's something I need to work on as well. Also, I need to be stricter in the class, because even though I consider myself the friendly teacher, sometimes some students surpass limits and I don't know how to handle that. And also because of my lack of experience. I've only got to the internships, but I need more experience regarding teaching in schools or institutes, etc. So some challenges regarding my weaknesses: to add more dynamism in the classroom, and to try to reduce my talking time, because of my lack of strategies. Sometimes I tend to talk a lot, and my students don't. And the analysis of the internship and the research experiences. As a strength, I need to highlight the comfortable environment in which my students were involved. I try to create activities which the students felt comfortable with. And my predisposition in both the internship and the research process. My weakness, well, time. That's time constraints as well. Because I think that this semester, and this is kind of a reflection for me, I took things too easy. So I lacked time, along with the fact that we're not given so much time, but I took things too easy, I think. Some challenges: to avoid hostility in the classroom. Sometimes my students got to the class bored, exhausted, tired, and so am I. And my organization. I think that things get messy when I don't have time, and I become nervous and I don't know what to do, and then I freak myself out. But that's something that I need to work on. And that's it. I hope you have enjoyed it. There are the references.